Today on the MrMaple Show, take a deep dive and discover the world of Acer sieboldianum.
Konnichiwa, y'all. I'm Matt, and that's my brother Tim, and welcome to the MrMaple Show. We've got a fun one today. We're going to be talking about a little overview of Acer sieboldianum.
I mean, it's one of those fun things to go through and hit up all these different species and talk about, the history behind them and highlight some cultivars with them. And that's what we'll be doing with Acer sieboldianum. Y'all, check us out on your favorite podcast platform. Give us a 5-star rating. Make sure you're subscribed. Check us out on YouTube. And remember, we are a family mail order Japanese maple nursery. We ship directly to your door. We do over 1,000 varieties of Japanese maples.
And we can ship those around the country here in the United States. We do ship to Hawaii and Alaska when we're dormant. We don't ship to you out in leaf. And it's all inside the United States. But even if you're outside the United States, you can join that Maple Mafia by subscribing. And we really appreciate your participation. There's an awesome amount of people in that chat. So these videos also air on YouTube on Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. So if you love our podcast, go catch them there. Join that chat. It's a fun way to kind of get involved. There's a big international community actually in that chat going on too. So it's kind of fun.
Now, next up, what we're going to be doing is talking about Acer sieboldianum. And this is a cultivar or a species, and all the cultivars are closely related to all the cultivars of Japanese maples and the species of Japanese maples. I mean, Acer sieboldianum's insection palmata, it fits in there with the japonicums and the shirayus and the palmatums. It's super closely related.
Yeah, Philip von Siebold, 1796 to 1866. He's where the name sieboldianum comes from. Siebold. Now, he was a famous German physician. Some people say optometrist, but we can't really confirm that. So we're just going to go with physician. He joined the Dutch military and was appointed to the ship physician in the East Indies. So basically, Siebold loved to sail around and visit a lot of Asian countries. This is why he actually helped introduce many species to the Western world, bringing them back to Holland. Now, Siebold became a physician, and as he gained popularity, he was able to go further into these countries, gaining him more access to the flora and fauna of these countries. And that's where Siebold comes from, sieboldianum. He eventually brought those back to Holland. And many of the cultivars, there's a famous story from Esveld even, where he sailed up to Esveld Plantaneum many generations back and dropped off the original Arium, which is an Acer shirayus. But Siebold certainly helped influence a lot of the flora and fauna that became to Trompenberg and a lot of the early plants coming to especially Holland, England, and Germany.
I mean, Siebold, until that point, Japan had been closed off. I mean, it was not letting anyone onto their main island. And essentially, he got in by being a physician at a major trade island right off the coast of Japan and used that to get his way in to go check out all the plants and cool stuff going on. And while he was being a physician, he was also loading up the ship with cool plants. And if it wasn't for this, this was the very first time that plants started coming out of Japan. Mm-hmm. And it's just crazy that, it took a doctor to be able to figure out a way to get into plants. And it's kind of crazy because doctors are the people that are really into gardening with Japanese maples.
He was the original doctor collector as well.
Yeah.
All right, so Siebold, the legends kind of get bigger sometimes the more people you talk to. A lot of people have alluded to that he basically would be sneaking stuff behind people's back onto the boat. So he kind of seems like a pirate in my mind. I think of this guy being a little bit of pirate, He's out there, helping people. Being a doctor by day, but by night they're loading these B&Bs but onto a ship, right?
But according to Talon's blog, he loved all things Japanese. I mean, he's got Japanese daughters and Japanese. so Talon goes in to say, it's a lot like Talon himself. He loved all things Japanese. But, this wasn't, Acer sieboldianum wasn't named by Siebold.
Right.
Siebold found Acer sieboldianum, had started doing the description work for it, but never completed it during his lifetime. And so if you'll see Acer sieboldianum, it says Mikhail beside of it in 1878. He's the one who actually finished the description and finished the actual write-up on Acer sieboldianum, and it officially became Acer sieboldianum because of what Mikhail's work did, even though it wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Siebold. I mean, Siebold died in 1866, officially became Acer sieboldianum in 1878.
So really interesting backstory there with Siebold. Now, certainly these plants would have existed in Japan and were identified predating that, but that's their official scientific classification. So really interesting there how it becomes Siebold from sieboldianum. Great plants, y'all. I think this is a category that's underutilized, underrated. We'll get into a few of the cultivars at the end of the podcast, but we like kind of giving you an overview of kind of its whereabouts and how it kind of got into popularity, how it got here, especially.
So I've got this book, The Handbook of Japanese Maples by Gary Takashi, and we bought it when we went to Japan. Matt and I, we drove over 3,000 miles around in Japan, and because of that, I did a lot of research trying to figure out, what's the best way to travel in Japan. And one of the things I came across was this handbook by A Handbook of Japanese Maples by Gary Takashi. And what it does is it has descriptions, photos, it has of all the different species in Japan, and actually shows where they're distributed across the map of Japan. And Acer sieboldianum, it has the furthest distribution across than any other species.
It's the most Japanese maple?
It's the most Japanese maple. It's all across. It's more across the mainland Japan than Acer palmatum.
That's incredible.
It's more across than anything you're looking at. And I'm like, that's crazy. It goes all the way from the southernmost part of Japan, all the way except to the very most northern part of Hokkaido, which is interesting. It's found in both the mountain and the coastal areas. It can grow as an understory tree, but it's also growing in open areas where the soil is moist. And by the way, this Handbook of Japanese Maples, it's all in Japanese. I use Google Translate, put it up there, read actual, it translates directly from the Japanese to the English. It's really cool to be able to do that whenever you're traveling. And
that's like old tech now. Like now you just download the book and switch it to English, right? And then the whole thing would already be there.
I know. It's crazy. But Acer sieboldianum, it's all over Japan. I mean, when you're going around and you're looking at different trees in Japan, there's a high likely it could be Acer sieboldianum because it's everywhere.
Yeah. And
that's one of the cool things about it. Whenever we're reading about, things from the National Arboretum, they're like, we collected this from the coast, Acer sieboldianum. So this is a plant that can handle extreme different temperatures. I mean, we're talking from the southern part of Japan all the way to the most northern part almost. And because of that, when people are doing these wild collections of Acer sieboldianum or selections of sieboldianum, there can be differences in like the hardiness based on the locale where the Acer sieboldianum was originally collected. I've heard about this from Mark Wethington plenty of times about his different collections.
I think a lot of Americans would be shocked to realize how big Japan is. It basically lines up pretty well. Now, it's not a one-to-one, but if you lay Japan on the United States, it would range from Boston almost down to Florida. Like it's very much the eastern United States, that long of a range. So it's a bigger, we look at the maps. Maps screw you up because you look at a map and things that are further away from the equator look small, but they're not necessarily small. So Japan sometimes looks smaller than it is, but it's a pretty big place. So really wide ranging there, and interesting that some areas are in more moist soils, some areas are in drier locations. Now, there's a specific species, Acer tenuifolium, that is often thrown in with Acer sieboldianum. Now, Yano's book states that Acer tenuifolium is not Acer sieboldianum, as many have accepted. We do some cultivars of that, like Acer tenuifolium Sode no uchi. You'll see that one commonly referred to as sieboldianum, although I think, and Tim thinks, and many experts think that actually could be tenuifolium. We've presented this theory to Douglas Justice, and he liked it a lot. He thought that was pretty on point.
Yeah, I was actually walking around the Swanson's garden in North Carolina, and from a distance, I was like, "Oh, is that a Acer tenuifolium?" And we walked over there, and it said Acer sieboldianum Sode no uchi, and Douglas Justice was like, "No, Tim, I think you're right. I think that is an Acer tenuifolium. Look at this." And he started looking down at the leaves, started looking at the way the branches were, and he was like, "I would actually lean to say this Acer tenuifolium." And Yano's book actually says Acer tenuifolium. And so it makes sense that many, there was Acer japonicum, and then there was Acer shirayu got divided out, and then Acer sieboldianum got divided out, and then Acer tenuifolium has gotten divided out again. And so it makes sense why some people may have grouped them all together at one point, and there's some confusion about, what these actual species are. But, Acer tenuifolium is very distinguishable when you actually see it versus Acer sieboldianum.
Now, the only other known cultivar right now in Acer tenuifolium would be Kikanzan. We've offered that one here several times. We also will offer Sode no uchi again, and likely next time we list it, we'll probably list it as Acer tenuifolium, separating it out from its sieboldianum normal listing.
Even though that's, commonly in the trade as Acer sieboldianum, Sode no uchi. That is very common. This is a controversial topic on whether it's sieboldianum or tenuifolium, but it just makes sense. Acer sieboldianum in the wild is very multi-stemmed tree. It's kind of small. It gives good orange-red fall color. And when we're reading things like Maples of the World, it says it gives good fall color even when there's varying levels of moisture and fertility, which would be something that Acer circinatum, people would say it isn't as good as Acer sieboldianum at doing this.
Yeah, now originally a lot of Acer sieboldianum was grouped with Acer japonicum, Acer shirayu, and Acer tenuifolium. Those were kind of, at one point, probably all mixed up, and a lot of those were really just called full moons. Botanically, they hadn't been given separate nomenclature and divided out as well. In Japan, this section is known as Kohuha. Thought I was doing that one. Thought that mountain was a little too steep. Started up that mountain and went, nope.
In Japan, this selection is known as Ko Hao Uchiwa Kaede. I may have butchered that, which means small leaf form.
Hey, I started up that mountain and it was a little too steep. I had to come back down. I know my role.
But if you look at that, you've got your japonicums, your shirayu, and your tenuifoliums, and the sieboldianums are typically one of the smaller leaf forms of those. So it makes complete sense. But I will say that can be misleading because I have seen some larger leaf sieboldianums. We'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, they're interesting. They, they want to be more open than Acer japonicum. You can see into them. They're definitely a different branching structure. They're more similarly related to Acer shirayu in many ways and how they branch. Like if you look at the structure of the tree, you can start to categorize those and shirayus out. And then they clearly have their own set of buds and set of bud formation. After you start to look at the close details of it, looks very different. Looks almost more palmatum than the other two.
Now, Acer sieboldianum, it is very interesting in its own regard. It's very multi-stemmed, almost like circinatum, but the leaf is a little more like an Acer shirayu like. And because of that, you get this really interesting dynamic in section palmata where it's just very distinguishable in itself. And it gets like these little hairs that can be on the actual stemming of the leaves. And it's so interesting that there's also a plant called Acer pseudosieboldianum that is like the false sieboldianum that looks like
it its own due, man. Quit calling it the fake sieboldianum.
I know, right? But we'll probably have to do another podcast at some point on Acer pseudosieboldianum because that's a whole different animal in itself.
It's time to embrace Acer pseudosieboldianum. They can be their own thing. They don't just have to be the fake sieboldianum anymore. All right, guys, let's get into some of the cultivars of these. There's some great ones. Again, a lot of these, to be fair with you, Tim and I have put into this category ourselves or kind of reclassified things. A lot of times in the nursery trade, things get really mixed up. And, genetic testing should need to be done to approve really any of these are parentage. But there's some obvious mistakes on things we see. So we'll try to fix those whenever possible based on our own understanding. Acer sieboldianum Aoyama.
I know this one's a little controversial because there's many nurseries who list this as Acer japonicum because, again, everything used to be classified as Acer japonicum.
I've seen it frequently listed as Acer palmatum back in the day. Like that was another one too. People listed just as Acer palmatum.
And I think that may just be getting mixed up with Acer palmatum Aoyama.
Right.
But there's Acer japonicum was this grouping originally, and then it got divided with Acer japonicum, Acer shirayu. And then people started realizing, hey, these need to be broken down further. And Aoyama really fits in that sieboldianum category. It's got the little hairs on the branches as it comes out, the little pubescent hairs on the actual leaf stems. It's got that unique foliage that screams sieboldianum. And the reason I think this one is interesting is this is a selection that seeds pretty prolifically.
Yeah, there's even one here locally of a Guriyama my dad sold back in the day. And it's in this little small garden that's, accessible still to us. And sometimes when I get out there, I'll collect seed on it because it seeds so readily and so frequently. It's been a fun one to use for our sieboldianum kind of test to kind of play around with what sieboldianum is and how it heals. We've used it as understock. We've sold straight sieboldianum seedlings as well. But that's kind of a fun one if you're into seed collection because it seeds a lot.
Now, when we talk about grafting Acer sieboldianum, it typically is grafted onto Acer palmatum because they're so closely related. But, there's been some thoughts on, is Acer sieboldianum as cold tolerant as Acer pseudosieboldianum? And so we want to do testing, and with that becomes, how do you do tests with things that are not on their own roots? Well, you get a seedling that's Acer sieboldianum, and then you graft sieboldianums on it for those tests. And we like to take things to the next level, and a Guriyama allows us to do that. One of the things that's really neat about a Guriyama, though, is that the leaves actually, it's smaller leaves than your typical, than even many of their Acer sieboldianum selections, but the leaves often will point a little upward at first at a young age. It's got this silver green kind of color to it, and it can go to some really nice shades of yellows and oranges in the fall.
Now, what a lot of the research says so far is still that sieboldianum is going to work zones 5 through 9. But very similar to Acer Shirayu, it is going to give you an added advantage in some of those polar vortex years in a zone 5. So it is a little more cold hardy than straight palmatum we're finding, but maybe not quite as cold hardy as Acer pseudosieboldianum.
And we'd mentioned that to Sue Wegriff, and it's really gotten us trying to dig into more of these species with superpowers and trying to figure out which superpowers Acer sieboldianum might have, if any, right, to really help us understand things. One thing that's interesting is the most southern part of Japan only gets down to like 45 degrees, 50 degrees, and they still have Acer sieboldianum down there.
Right.
And so this is a plant that may be able to handle some of those hotter zones better than many of other trees because it still goes into a dormancy to survive in that southern part of Japan. So something cool about Acer sieboldianum to think about for the future. But next up, we've got Acer sieboldianum Mikama.
Yeah, this is one we've offered several times here on Mr. Maple as well. Varying differences. A lot of your differences with Acer sieboldianum are leaf shape. Mikama has slightly smaller foliage, very rounded appearance to it. Very much like this plant. We've offered it, going back many, many years.
Yeah, it has a little bit flatter leaf, and instead of that silvery blue-green kind of color that a Guriyama can get, this one's a little bit more of that emerald green color. With that flatter leaf, it just makes a good mid-sized tree on the landscape. Again, Mikama is going to go to more of those yellows and oranges in the fall.
All right, guys, coming in here next, we've got Acer sieboldianum Kessagamayama. A lot of yamas here today.
Yeah,
a lot of mountains.
Yeah, Kessagamayama is one of those plants that years ago, Matt and I made really good friends with Dr. Richard Olson. And he eventually became the director of the National Arboretum. He's actually an NC State grad, and he graduated from the horticulture program, studied under J.C. Rouston, who the J.C. Rouston Arboretum is named after. And we've made really good friends with him throughout the years. We did a reintroduction program within the U.S. National Arboretum of cultivars that were in the ground at the U.S. National Arboretum that had not gotten out into the nursery trade, and Kessagamayama was one of those. Now, Kessagamayama has this larger leaf of an Acer sieboldianum, but the leaf points upwards almost like a Guriyama does.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the leaf. It's unique. It's very crisp and distinct in its foliage. You'll think it's drying out a little bit if you're not used to it, but if you're used to the subtleties of Japanese maples, it's definitely got its own charm to it. Typically around 10 foot and 15 years, kind of an upright vase shape overall. Its leaf shape and growth rate.
And it has those larger leaves. All these Acer sieboldianums, the seeds, whenever they display in the fall, are typically a bright red, and they display over top of the foliage, which adds a unique dynamic over top of this full moon style leaf. And I call this a full moon because remember, all these were grouped originally as Acer japonicum, the full moon Japanese maples, and they've been divided out since.
Who gets that classification now? Is it Acer japonicum or Acer shirayu? We'll let them fight it out. But really, the whole category are kind of moons, right? I love this one. Great fall colors, typically fiery orangey reds. A lot of orange going on in there, typical with some bold reds late. But just great colors on it, and really unique too. I like the folding up foliage. All right, so next up, we've got one we offer a good bit here at Mr. Maple. We've got Acer sieboldianum Kumo nishiki. Now, y'all know this one we offered a good bit. Probably one of the very best variegated selections of sieboldianum, japonicum, shirayu, any of those other full moons we were mentioning. This is probably the most strikingly variegated form.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this is I look at it and I think, this is Acer sieboldianum, and was this tree found as just a chance seedling and some variegation happened, which happens all the time in species, or is this a hybrid with a Japanese maple? Is this a hybrid with an Acer palmatum? I should say that because
Right.
Acer sieboldianum is clearly in Japan. But Kumo nishiki is just this large leaf with these unique swirls in it. And there's nothing else that quite has the swirling variegation like Kumo nishiki does. It doesn't revert, and you just see these creamy whites and light greens and darker greens all throughout the foliage.
It's the Shacknosis shoe. For the 90s shoe fans, it's the Sean Kemp Kamikaze or the Shacknosis Reeboks. It's got all those swirling going on. It really is almost like a psychedelic looking pattern to it. It's cool. I love it. It's just a repeating swirl. You can get lost in Kumo nishiki, especially in early spring. Kind of a lime green. Sometimes you can get more white on it by giving it more shade, but you can get a lime green on dark green. Really just a striking plant. Great in the fall color too. When you have variegation so strong that it shows through in the fall, I really enjoy that. So typically a bold red with almost white to pink in the variegated part.
Do you think it's a variegated plant, or do you think it's a chance seedling? What would your thoughts be?
I would think because of its stability that it was a seedling. A lot of times seedlings are more stable than a sport occurrence. And this one, I've never really had it revert. And even if I've had it push a lot of new growth, I've always had it go back to being variegated. So my understanding would be it's more likely to be a seedling that was that strongly variegated. Like sometimes seedlings lock it in a little better than a sport.
Yeah, that's so true. And I hadn't thought about that. And part of me wonders if this is just what we're seeing when something like Aridano nishiki hybridizes with this Acer sieboldianum.
Right.
I mean, is this what you get? Is something that's just so much better on its stability in always showing that variegation?
And it may just be genetic variants within sieboldianum. It may be completely sieboldianum with no palmatum influence. That's not to say we can't have variegated sieboldianums as well, right?
Well, the fun thing about this is if Acer sieboldianum Kumo nishiki is this amazing, and it's something that can hybridize with Acer palmatum, like Sue and many of other people have talked about. Mm-hmm. Can we use this to then get cooler Acer palmatum hybrids out of Kumo nishiki?
All right, y'all. Coming in next, we've got Acer sieboldianum Shirayu no Sume. That is the Claw of the Dragon. Another one we frequently offer here at Mr. Maple. Just a great plant. This one really hooks people in, pun intended, with the claws. It's got really cool foliage, and when people see it, it kind of just captures the imagination, especially with children. If you've got that dragon theme going on and it looks like claws, it's easy to kind of go out and check on the dragon claw in the garden, especially when it looks like little hands.
Now, this one has that silver blue kind of color, that silver green kind of color I was talking about with the Aoyama. And to me, the foliage is really interesting because it has that unique shape, but it, to me, looks like a linear lobum that is crossed with Acer sieboldianum. And so, again, I would argue that this is another possible palmatum hybrid that happened, and it just is very unique and different. It has that very multi-stemmed habit that you see out of Acer sieboldianum. You often see these very dense and upright, but it's got that foliage that just looks like a little claw of a dragon.
Yeah, really cool stuff there. Great heat tolerance, this one, too. I know Chris Adel's growing this one in full sun, darn near in Wilmington, like in high heat areas. So that speaks a little bit to its variability for cold and heat tolerance. I've seen it growing in very cold areas. Seems to give you that edge again on those colder polar vortex type zone 5 winters. I really like Shirayu no Sume, though. I think its ornamental traits are kind of off the charts. Great fall colors, all around just a phenomenal plant.
I remember when NJ Acer Edshin had one of these in New Jersey. It was one of the first ones that I saw. And then whenever I saw it in Japan, I was like, this thing is off the charts. It was a plant that I just had to have because seeing it at Yano's place and seeing it in person again, the more you see this plant, the more you fall in love with it because it distinguishes itself from everything else that's out there.
All right, y'all, coming in here next, we've got the weeping form. We've got to have the variegated, the linear lobum, and the weeping form. We've got Acer sieboldianum Seki no Kigon. Now, this was found at Nikko National Park, an area me and Tim love to talk about because we've been there a few times. Actually, 3 times, twice on one trip. Beautiful area in Japan. Just absolutely outstanding foliage there. I mean, you can go see Japonicums, Shirayu, and sieboldianums all growing there natively, and lots of other big maples as well. But Seki no Kigan was actually found as a pendulous form there growing in the wild.
Now, it's named after a local waterfall there in Nikko National Park. And it's kind of cool how, that is something that's a tradition that's sort of passed on, is naming them after local monuments and local things. And that's why Matt and I also named one of our weeping selections after a local waterfall, the Looking Glass Falls. That's an Acer palmatum. But this sieboldianum Seki no Kigan was really a game changer because it is the first pendulous Acer sieboldianum, and it's the first pendulous in that full moon group that has a full moon like foliage.
Yeah, this thing's going to be shaped a little bit more like your traditional lace leaf. So think of the shape of this one looking a little bit more Tomukiyama. It's more wide and spreading. Definitely reminds me a little bit more of something like Jiro Shidari than something like Ryusen. Excellent weeping plant, though. Great red fall color typically on this one. It's been exceptionally heat tolerant. It's been quite vigorous for us. We have one of the biggest ones I've ever seen here. We were able to obtain one from Fred Hooks when he first had it at NJ Acers, probably back in 2010. Oh my gosh, that thing is a beast now. It is massive. Really a beautiful tree. My kids get up under it and play in it. It's part of the fairy garden area where the kids actually go and take their toys and make little fairy gardens, but they can actually get up under this thing's canopy. Just a beautiful specimen and a tree that does get out there. It surprised me in how quickly this one grows in the right conditions. I have two of them now that have gotten quite big.
Now, what's interesting to me is that the pendulous version of sieboldianum has that full moon style sieboldianum leaf, where the pendulous version of like an Acer Shirayu, you look at Green River and Kauai, those are more divided like lace leaf Acer they look almost Acer palmatum dissectum, but you can see that there's a Shirayu influence into it.
Maybe just more palmatum influence to it. And this may be more straight sieboldianum, where that's looking like more of a hybrid with a dissectum.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you're getting all these different traits, though, with sieboldianum. And the thing I like about Seki no Kigan is just how it arches and curves. It really makes a dynamic tree out there in the landscape. I read about this in the Maple Society newsletter, and it was interesting because it was just getting released in Japan, but Matt and I already had it in the garden at our parents' home on Maplewood Knoll Gardens. And, it was just like reading about this tree and seeing this, tree that they say is over 100 years old. It's like 10 foot tall, 10, 12 foot wide. And then now we've got one at my parents' garden that is approaching that in its size already.
It's got out there quickly. All right, guys, here's another one from the National Arboretum and one of my personal favorites, Acer Sieboldium Yaoyaigasa. I try to make this one available as frequently as possible. This tree has some of the largest foliage of anything in the categorized as Acer Sieboldianum. May have some Japonicum influence. We've talked to Sue, and they've talked about how Japonicums and Sieboldiums may have a genetic ability to hybridize. We'll have to do some testing to prove that, but for now, it is the largest tree that has those Sieboldianum-like characteristics.
Now, this was found along the coast by Dr. Creech at the National Arboretum. So this is a more coastal selection, and it has that really, really large leaf to it, which is unusual because we just talked about how Acer Sieboldianum is the small leafed maple. This sort of breaks those rules. And that's why he was interested in this plant, is because it was, stood out from the other plants that were out there. But it's also the reason why I'm really interested in it. And like you said, it may be a hybrid with Acer japonicum. And if it is, it does have stemming that is different than your typical Acer sieboldianum. Mm-hmm. The foliage looks very much like Acer sieboldianum, but it's larger. And so can we have one of those plants that is the key plant that can be that middle ground for hybridizing Acer japonicum and Acer palmatum? I mean, this could be that middle ground to be able to bring in japonicum traits into section palmatum.
Yeah, I love the foliage. Absolutely draws me in. I love that even in 1 gallons you can get, 8-inch foliage sometimes. It gets crazy. It's very distinguishable when it's a young plant because the foliage can be quite large even on juvenile growth. Yaoyaigasa is really fun. It is another one, kind of like Hong Long, that was originally wild collected, but then given cultivar status based on its ornamental traits. So this was originally wild collected. So this would have just been Acer Sieboldianum wild collected, with succession numbers at one point. But somebody had the wherewithal to go, That looks nothing like our other sieboldianum wild collections. This one is worthy of a cultivar status, giving it the Yaoyama signification there. And I absolutely love that. I love when cultivars are wild collected. It just gives them a little extra cool factor.
Yeah, you got to think about, this trip to the National Arboretum, and they're traveling along the coast and they spot this plant. It just puts the tree into perspective and gives you a little bit of the origin story behind it. And whenever you get a story behind a plant, you can enjoy not only the plant, but the story that goes along with it. And that's what I love about, these wild collected things. You've got this plant explorer who did all this work to get out there, and then they actually found something. And it's just like that victory. It's like, yeah, I got it. Next up, we have a selection that was introduced by Dick Vandermatt. And again, some people list this as Acer Shirayu, but we believe Ukisha is an Acer sieboldianum.
Everybody likes to say this one around the nursery. We'll be shipping these and people go, ooh, Keisha. I don't know why it's become that. But Ukisha, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. It's probably Dutch. Ukisha is how we've always had this one listed. Man, this thing puts on a display in the fall. I've had it be neon yellow and red and orange at the same time, all on the same plant. Just phenomenal fall colors. Another one where the foliage cups up a little bit. So this one tends to have a medium-sized leaf with the foliage kind of cupping upward. It's been some of the best dang fall color I can ever remember. I mean, this one would definitely be in the running for me for best fall color on a sieboldianum. Nice crisp leaf to it as well.
Yeah, the leaf actually looks almost like it could be a sieboldianum ex Shirayu. So that would almost make sense if you really start to study this out. I mean, if sieboldianum does have this ability to be able to hybridize, it's interesting that you could get all these different colors and everything coming into Acer sieboldianum through a possible hybrid with Shirayu. The leaf is larger, and so it's a larger leaf selection with that little bit of cup up to it. It just adds something extra to the selection.
All right, so these next two Acer sieboldianums are variegated forms in Japan. They're highly unstable, but we do have them here at Mr. Maple. You'll see these in Yano's book for maples. First up is Mikasa nishiki and Kazuhara nishiki.
Yeah, Mikasa nishiki is basically a variegated form of Mikasayama. So very similar foliage, but it's variegated on top of that. And you can get some white to yellow variegation on both of these selections. Kazuhara nishiki has proven to be just as unstable as Mikasa nishiki, which has been proven to be just as unstable as something like Fujinami nishiki.
True. So you're killing it, by the way, on foliage today. I never say foliage. I just avoid the word because people roast me in the comments when I say foliage. My southern accent, they say, no, it's foliage. And you're just absolutely like off the cuff. Like, I don't know what changed, man. You're killing it.
I think the first time I said it today, I said foliage, and I was like, you know what? I'm going for foliage the rest of the way.
I'm sticking with foliage. So next up, I like the foliage on this one. Acer sieboldianum Ingolstadt. Another one from Holland. I believe this one's a Dick Vandermatt introduction.
Yeah, and Ingolstadt has basically, it looks like a red Matsumuri version of an Acer sieboldianum. So this is going to be an interesting selection that is, on that more palmatum side. We're looking at a lot of hybrids when we're talking about these sieboldianums. And a lot of DNA work is going to have to be done to prove exactly what these things are.
Right.
But it's red.
Yeah, it's the first red. Kind of got more of a Matsumuri style leaf to it. We've offered this one a few times. Could be groundbreaking here too, though. I mean, especially for being that missing link between the two. Really cool plant.
Now, next up, we've got Acer sieboldianum Lavette. Some people list this as Japonicum and Shirayu again. And Lavette is one of those plants that, there is a Japonicum Lavette at NJ Acers. The leaf is like a smaller Aconitofolium, a smaller Meikujaku. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about that selection. We're talking about the one that is an Acer sieboldianum. This is the one that you see at Esfeld Nursery. This is the one that you see online in Europe a lot. It's not that common in the United States. We've got one here at Mr. Maple.
It's kind of disappeared. Like, it's interesting. These things weren't as hard to find, I think, when we got started 20 years ago, really kind of hoarding maples. And now you don't see these at all. Like, I mean, this is something that's kind of disappeared completely. I think in many ways things have gotten more general, and people have gotten more palmatum centric. You don't see things like Lavette.
Now, Lavette is that shorter multi-stem selection. It's got a flatter leaf that has the pubescent hairs, a denser compact habit, smaller foliage overall, and the leaves on it just look very Acer sieboldianum all the way around. It's an interesting tree that you just don't see in the nursery trade anymore, and we should definitely be bringing it back again on Mr. Maple in the near future.
So we've joked before that Dr. Brown, Acer palmatum dissectum, Dr. Brown's the best Japanese maple with the worst name. Well, there is an Acer sieboldianum Isis, which is actually, the name actually predates the Terra group, right? Like that actually is an Egyptian goddess.
I think it does have a really bad name. This is a selection we've got one at Mr. Maple in our Area 51, and it's more common in Europe. It's a smaller leafed Acer sieboldianum. So it's one of the smallest leaves on any of the Siebold maples of any of the selections. It's not one that's really been that interesting to me, so we hadn't produced a lot of it. But it is a tree that's out in the trade, especially in Europe.
I was just afraid to list it. I didn't want to get on like some governmental list for our website. Acer sieboldianum Firefall, fairly new selection by Crispin Silva. Great fall colors. The name again is a little tricky because there's so many Firefalls and so many things close to Firefall in the trade. There's Acer palmatum dissectum Firefall. So I do wish it had a different cultivar name for it, but Acer sieboldianum Firefall is one we've recently offered here, and it seems to be a great plant.
Yeah, it's got that larger Acer sieboldianum leaf. It's almost like a Matsumuri or Armenum style version of a
little more divided
sieboldianum, and it has phenomenal fall colors to it. I understand the reason why the name was given Firefall, but again, there's already palmatum dissectum Firefall, and then there's Acer palmatum falls fire. I mean, there's so many things that sound so close to that, including one that has the exact same name. But there's a number of other sieboldianum cultivars in Maples of the World that are not currently in the trade. One particular note is one called Tortuosum that is described in 1886 in Russia. And it says it's lost to the trade. And I wish it wasn't, because the branches, that's described as the branches spiral in different directions. And if that wasn't lost in the trade, if anyone knows where a Acer sieboldianum Tortuosum is, guys, hook us up.
Yano introduced several. So Yano, again, like we talked about in our Japonicum podcast, and many of these need to make sure to be saved even in Japan, because Yano has since passed. I don't know what all's happening with World Maple Park. I've reached out to some friends there, but he had Acer sieboldianum that he was introducing in the trade, Katsura Gasan and Orison.
And I think we may have Katsura Gasan somewhere in our Area 51 collection. I'll have to try to see if we can't locate an Orison, because that looks pretty cool too.
One of my favorite things I've seen pictures of, and I don't have, is I've seen pictures in Japan of Acer sieboldianum Aureum. That absolutely gets me excited. The leaf distinctly looks more Acer sieboldianum, but it has a pale yellow color to it. So endless possibilities for going forward in the future for cultivar selections for Acer sieboldianum. And another thing that makes it interesting for future selections are there's not that much diversity. I mean, you've got a weeping one, you've got a variegated one, you've got a yellow one now. You've got some great fall colors. You've got different leaf shapes, but the door is wide open. It's not like palmatum. I mean, there's not 50 cultivars of Acer sieboldianum.
And there should be. I mean, right. There's enough genetic diversity in Acer sieboldianum that we're seeing from these cultivars that are already here that you could find and introduce new and different selections of Acer sieboldianum that are uniquely different. And we're seeing a lot of hybrids that are happening with palmatums, shirosonums, possibly japonicums. And so it's interesting to see not only this as a tree that can introduce interesting selections itself, but ones that can be the bridge species between species that don't hybridize, like Acer palmatum and Acer japonicum.
All right, guys, if you made it this far in the podcast, you got to like and subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star on any of your major podcast platforms, too. That helps other people find us. Share us on your social media or with your gardening clubs. If you have gardening clubs or you're in Facebook groups that are related to Japanese maples, we'd greatly appreciate if you shared our podcast there. And look us up on YouTube. We add all kinds of content there. I think you're going to love it if you're into gardening.
Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.